Hey, it's Nicholas here today with a 60-minute talk on the paper, The Real Problem of Consciousness Requires New Physics, which you can find on SciArXiv here, or the Center for Dialogue in Science website here. So of course, the natural place to start any discussion of consciousness is in the famous hard problem of gravitation, which I've totally made up, but which will illustrate some useful points about what's been called the real problem of consciousness, and the central issue of this talk, which really is the measurement problem of consciousness, not the real problem per se. So if there were a hard problem of gravity, it would undoubtedly involve metaphysical musings about how and why it is that matter energy creates gravitational attraction. Whereas what's scientifically tractable isn't the hard problem. It's what we could call the real problem of gravitation, characterizing the orderly regularities relating space-time curvature and the metric here and the stress energy momentum tensor here in the field equations of general relativity, this overall mathematical structure. And something that perhaps goes unnoticed in this real problem solution is how starkly different the physical quantities on the two sides of this equation are. Now, we may make up some intuition of how, like, the denser matter energy is, the more it scrunches up space-time, but that's really just an informal way of restating the content of this equation. There's no inherent reason why, for example, denser matter energy configurations couldn't lead to less scrunched up space-time in some other universe. Now, we may discover later some more fundamental machinery that translates density into scrunchedness, but for now, those kinds of how and why are just buried, really, in this equal sign here. Okay, so now to where you maybe expected me to start, the hard problem of conscious experience. Now, there are numerous formulations and interpretations of this, which I'm not going to go over again here, just to point out that often, or typically, they do pose some kind of how and why questions about the brain to conscious experience relationship. So again, instead of metaphysical hows and whys, we could look at what's been called the real problem, trying to establish the detailed form of this equation, which I first stated in 2014. As we'll see, these angle brackets SAB terms over here are labels or symbols for certain components of conscious experience. A over here is a generic symbol for all aspects of brain activity that are relevant to conscious experience. And this function phi, which isn't the same phi as the integrated information folks use, contains the details of the brain activity conscious experience relationship. Now, just as for the field equations of general relativity, this equation relates to starkly disparate natural order phenomena. Here, conscious experience, and here, brain activity. So just as in the gravitational equations, a lot of the how and the why of this relationship is left unexplored, buried in the equal sign and the phi function here. The point is that science isn't the same as answering every how and why question. We can make tremendous scientific advances while leaving many such hows and whys unanswered. And the study of conscious experience shouldn't be put on hold while we try to answer questions about it that we haven't answered really about any other natural phenomenon, for example, gravity. So far, so good. But to make progress on establishing equations like these, we need data. And the curvature of space-time isn't directly observable. Even if we had a terrestrial curvature meter, we'd want to understand curvature in the far distant universe, and then we'd have to send these meters out and wait for them to send data back. So there are actually a number of ways to measure curvature that don't depend on a curvature meter. Centrally, we can use these geodesic equations that govern the motion of test particles. This motion can be observed, and then we can relate these Christoffel symbols in the geodesic equations back to the left-hand side of the field equations, thus providing data needed to validate the precise form of these equations here. So the message is that direct observability or measurability isn't a problem as long as there's some way of inferring required involved data. So next, naturally, we come to the measurement problem of conscious experience. Again, the variables on the left-hand side aren't directly observable, so we're going to have to infer them. Now, this is where things get a little tricky, especially if you're new to this field, or even if you're not new. The central investigation of the paper takes these symbols to label visual conscious experience. So isn't it in a way meaningless to say that what these symbols refer to isn't observable? They are symbols for observation itself. So how could what they point to or label be unobservable? So the essential issue is that while my experience may be observable to me and yours to you, I can't see, so to speak, your experience and you can't see mine. So for example, if you move your gaze between these two rectangles here, which might be different stimuli in an experiment, you'll have different visual experiences. A chair on a gray background or just a gray background. But right now, as you move your attention, I don't know which experience you're having. So here we enter the tangled topic of subjective report. On the one hand, it may seem obvious that I can report my experience to you and you to me, and we can use that as scientific data. On the other hand, that may seem like untrustably subjective and unscientific data. But on the other hand, as we'll see, the standard understanding of the conduct of all science, including science that's not directly about conscious experience, uses conscious experience everywhere. For example, in the collection of data from instruments like thermometers or gravimeters. So if conscious experience is scientifically inadmissible, it's hard to see how science itself can function. To be frank, though, most people in science seem to want to brush this under the carpet, or even better, bury it. So the focus of the paper and this talk concerns the scientific viability of report. Certainly, there are some assumptions that have to be made to admit report as scientific data, and those assumptions should be made clear. And certainly, too, we should put effort towards admitting report as scientific data, as long as it can still be scientific, because science itself and our sole contact with the reality science studies depends on experience and report of experience. So I could probably talk for another hour about the assumptions needed to found a science of conscious experience, and maybe I will another time. But this talk is really about the kind of assumption we can't make in science. So sometimes assumptions or axioms might be a matter of debate. You might think that this assumption set is okay. I might think that that one is. Your opinion might be that there's no place in science for assumptions or axioms. However, again, as we'll see, because science depends on conscious experience, we're going to have to make some assumptions somewhere. Now, we may disagree about specific assumptions or about the role of assumptions in general in science. But we should, I believe, as scientists, all be able to agree on one thing. Science should be contradiction-free, or at least as free of contradictions as possible. And we should not make assumptions that add contradictions to pre-existing science. So what does all this have to do with the measurement problem of consciousness? Well, as I'll show, assuming that we can simply introduce subjective report into as-is science does lead to a contradiction, even if we make all the other assumptions needed to deal with things like honesty of report, this technical problem called inverted spectra, which relates to the more general possibility that similar brains might not produce similar experiences. So the headline result is that even if we make all the allowable assumptions to try to make subjective report a solution to the measurement problem of consciousness, we will still run into a fatal problem. This problem stems from the fact that the real problem and the measurement problem occur in a definite context, namely current physical theory, which all other scientific disciplines must cohere with unless they can advance incontrovertible evidence that physical theory itself must advance. Now, current physical theory is itself a member of a larger theory class, which I call dynamically orthodox physics. And as we'll see, under dynamically orthodox physics, subjective report can't be a scientifically reliable data collection method. So the pre-existence of a particular form of physical theory prevents us from just assuming outright, for example, that report can be used to create a science of experience. Because the measurement problem can't be resolved under dynamically orthodox physics, neither can the real problem. But once we've understood why dynamically orthodox physics forbids the use of report in the real problem, we can easily identify a new physics, strongly unorthodox dynamical regime in which the real problem of consciousness becomes genuinely scientific. Now, you may be wondering if the foundations of current physical theory conflict with scientific advance on the real problem. How is it that flagship publications like Science, Nature, Nature Reviews Neuroscience, and a whole host of other major journals not shown here are promoting, pretty much unquestioned, the idea that we already have a science of conscious experience? Well, there are a number of ways of understanding how we've got here. One that is both confronting and constructive is to go back to the headline result and put it this way. If reporting subjective experience is contradicted by fundamental physical theory, then science itself is contradictory. Its orthodox dynamical content denies its subjective experiential conduct, so to speak. So the blatant contradiction of seeing dynamically orthodox consciousness science on the covers of Science and Nature is just a natural consequence of a lingering contradiction in the content and conduct of science as a whole. So to understand all this in a bit more detail, we have to look at the issue of investigating some generic unexplained phenomenon in the context of a pre-existing science. So what does it take to move forward into a truly scientific investigation of this phenomenon? In particular, what does it take if the phenomenon we're looking at is, in some sense, radically novel? In one view, such phenomena demand a phase of investigation that we could call proto-science. Now, in this view, the need for a proto-scientific phase, the reason why we've ended up with a bunch of high-profile journals promoting a science of consciousness that really doesn't exist yet is because this proto-scientific phase was never really completed for the consciousness science that really began in the 1990s. As I'll amplify in a moment, though, another way of looking at this is that the pre-existing science was never really consistent. It's not a problem with consciousness science, but with the pre-existing science. But these two views are really two sides of one coin. So let's look now at what it takes to do a real proto-scientific assessment of a new phenomenon. The first thing we have to do is make a tentative definition. And the fact that this step might be difficult or controversial is more or less indicative of what we mean here by a radically novel phenomenon. So then the next thing in the proto-scientific phase is to make an assessment of the viability and consistency of putting this tentative definition, plus a proposed methodology for exploring it, together with the pre-existing science. If this assessment establishes that the mix isn't viable or consistent, we have to go back to the previous stage and then keep tweaking things, keep going around this circle until we get to a coherent set, in which case we can, at least in principle, proceed to a scientific investigation. So really, the paper is about completing this proto-scientific phase for the real problem of consciousness for the first time and establishing the conditions under which we really can have a scientific investigation of conscious experience. Now, problems at this stage here aren't fundamentally about consciousness piece of the science, at least in the way I'm going to frame it. They're actually to do with the fact that the pre-existing scientific enterprise built on dynamically orthodox physics, DOP, is self-contradictory. It's not consistent. And so strongly dynamically unorthodox physics, SDUP, isn't just the only possible basis for consciousness science. It's the only possible basis for a non-contradictory conduct of science as a whole. Okay, so as a précis then, a proto-scientific assessment involves four major steps, which I'm going to go through in a moment. A good enough phenomenon definition, which links the phenomenon to pre-existing science. Relatedly, a construal of pre-existing science, which is framed in a way that directly relates to the investigation of the new phenomenon. Then a rigorous analysis of potential contradictions, placing the tentatively defined new phenomenon in the pre-existing context, focusing especially on a proposed methodology for scientific investigation. So finally, if this analysis, step 3, discovers contradictions, we see if the whole setup can be tweaked in a way that would allow for contradiction-free science going forwards. So let's do it. Let's do a proto-science of conscious experience right now. So the field standard orienting definition, D1 in the paper, points to sights, sounds, and so on, which occur in wakefulness and dreams, but disappear in deep sleep. Now, while that D1 definition is a good start, it's really not enough, certainly not to integrate conscious experiential science with the pre-existing physics that underpins the scientific enterprise. So a major innovation in the paper is a new mathematical physics symbolism for conscious experience. If we first define conscious experience of a chair, say by contrast with a chair as studied in current physics, we can define two symbols. So angle brackets chair, italic chair, to label the collection of atoms and molecules studied by conventional physics, and then angle brackets italic chair to label the conscious experience of that conventional physics object. Then we can take that angle bracket symbolism a stage further. So defining a set of symbols, SAB, for fundamental stimuli underpinning conscious experience, things like oriented edges and colored patches, we can define the corresponding atomistic components of conscious experience as a set angle brackets SAB. So the key point is that the SAB are definable relative to pre-existing physical theory as collections of fundamental entities, while the angle brackets SAB are a complete basis for visual experience. So now we have a detailed way of relating conscious visual experience and its construction to pre-existing physical theory. So moving on from the definition of the new phenomenon in a way that relates to pre-existing science, the second proto-scientific step is a construal of pre-existing science which directly relates methodological investigation of the new phenomenon newly defined. So here's the dynamically orthodox construal of current physical theory, which I mentioned in previewing the headline result. It says that physics depends on fundamental entities, omega sub I, properties, P sub Ji, of those entities, laws L sub H of all of the above, and then three, perhaps less familiar things. These angle brackets SAB symbols, which we just looked at, conditions phi A, the physical instantiation of the referent of those symbols, and then these E causal constrictions on angle brackets SAB labeled phenomenon, E causality I'll explain a bit on the next slide. But what are these phi sub A things? Essentially, phi A of angle brackets SAB takes the value 1 if the conditions for the existence of angle brackets SAB are satisfied, and takes the value 0 otherwise. So these lowercase phi functions are sort of indicator function basis for the uppercase phi function we saw earlier, relating brain activity A to the set of angle brackets symbols. Now, the e-causal restriction in dynamically orthodox physics means that if conscious experiential components are conditional on some A states of the brain, these conscious experiential components can't acquire causal effect over and above that attributable to those A states. And this natural condition leads to the following problem. So brain activity states A lead to conscious experiential states that instantiate a new kind of angle brackets qualia valued information. But those qualia valued states can't have any causal impact over and above the A states that instantiated them. So this means that under orthodox dynamical physics, matter systems can't report on their own qualia valued states in a scientifically reliable way. The measurement problem is insoluble, and the real problem isn't part of science, which leads to a contradiction if we assert, as some do right now, that the dynamically orthodox real problem is part of science. So actually, this assertion adds to a pre-existing contradiction because, as I've said, the other side of the coin, so to speak, of real problem dynamically orthodox contradictions is that the conduct of science, the pre-existing science, using reports of subjective experience already contradicts its own physical foundations if those foundations are dynamically orthodox, as they are right now. So then again, as I've already said, if we understand the origins of these proto-scientific problems, they are reasonably easy to fix, at least in theory. So now under strongly dynamically unorthodox physics, we actively assert that all necessary informational coupling of qualia valued angle brackets labeled phenomenon with brain activity, which makes the scientific contradictions disappear. Now, of course, we would need evidence that our reality, our universe, this one, actually, angle brackets, this one, is strongly dynamically unorthodox. Otherwise, we'd introduce a contradiction now between strongly dynamically unorthodox theory and not strongly dynamically unorthodox reality. So I'll talk more about experiments on determining whether our reality is dynamically orthodox or unorthodox later in this presentation. So when I say all this, in particular, there's a methodological contradiction for conscious experiential science. People in the field have a number of strong reactions. So one is, can't we think of conscious experience here as just like temperature, T? In which case, there's no in principle objection to a matter system reporting on its own temperature value states. And then another strong reaction is that it seems subjectively obvious that matter systems can report on their own qualia valued states, at least when the system is a human. For example, it seems obvious that when I report on the blueness of the sky, that report originates in the actual blueness I'm experiencing. And then there are a whole host of other objections which fall into a couple of major groups. There are the objections to the fact that we can't do real problem science under dynamically orthodox physics, this group, and then a complementary set objecting to the fact that we can do that science under strongly dynamically unorthodox physical theories. Okay, so here's how we'll proceed from here. First, I will go over the headline result in more detail, covering the role of conscious experience in science, something called the meta-Hamiltonian argument, and experimental tests on unorthodox versus orthodox regimes. And then with that more detailed demonstration in hand, I'll offer a diagnosis of disagreements covering the just like temperature objection, the alleged subjective obviousness of the reliability of subjective report, as well as other things mentioned on the previous slide. So if you're watching this online, these will be parts 2 and parts 3 of this hour-long presentation. Thanks for watching.